The mess hall was silent except for the soft clink of metal trays against wooden tables. Autumn sunlight poured through tall windows, catching specks of dust suspended in the air like tiny stars. Three German women stood frozen, each holding an institutional tray, each staring down at what lay before them with expressions that bordered on disbelief. Helga Schmidt, 35 years old and still carrying herself with the rigid posture of a Wehrmacht communications officer, whispered in German. Her voice was barely audible, but the words carried the weight of a confession. Sie nannten das Mittagessen. They called this lunch. On her tray sat a thick slice of meatloaf, its surface glistening with rich brown gravy that pooled at the edges. Beside it, a mound of mashed potatoes, so white and creamy that butter melted into a small golden lake at its center. Bright yellow corn kernels, each one plump and glistening with moisture. A dinner roll still faintly warm to the touch, with a pat of butter wrapped in foil. And impossibly absurdly, a wedge of apple pie with a golden crust that had cracked just enough to reveal the cinnamon-sugared fruit beneath. The aroma rising from that single tray was almost obscene in its richness. Savory meat mingled with sweet cinnamon. Fresh baked bread competed with the earthy smell of real butter. For women who had spent the last year subsisting on watery cabbage soup and bread that tasted more of sawdust than wheat, this simple American lunch might as well have been a royal banquet from a forgotten age. But to understand why that whispered question would shatter everything these three women believed about America, about war, about the very nature of victory and defeat, we must go back. Back 6 weeks to three very different moments of capture. Back to three very different women whose paths would converge in the belly of a ship crossing the Atlantic. Back to the day when the propaganda they had been taught met the reality they had never imagined. This is the story of how a plate of food became a weapon more powerful than any bomb, how abundance turned into accusation, how the enemy's mercy proved more devastating than their hatred could ever have been, and how three women who once swore loyalty to the Third Reich learned that true strength doesn't come from fear. It comes from principle. Berlin, August 1944. 15 feet beneath the shattered streets of the capital. In a concrete bunker that smelled of mildew and fear, Helga Schmidt worked by the light of a single bare bulb. Around her, the muffled thunder of Allied bombers rolled across the city in waves, each one sending small cascades of dust from the ceiling. She didn't flinch. Helga Schmidt had long since stopped flinching. At 35, she had the sharp features and steel-gray eyes of someone who had never learned the language of doubt. She was the daughter of a great war officer who had died when she was 8, leaving her with memories of a proud Germany destroyed by what her father called the humiliation of Versailles. She had watched her mother sell the family silver piece by piece during the hyperinflation years. She had stood in bread lines as a teenager, had seen grown men weep in the streets over worthless paper marks. When Adolf Hitler rose to power promising to restore German dignity, Helga had believed him with the fervor of the converted. She joined the Signals Intelligence Division in 1939, not because she was forced, but because she wanted to serve. Every message she decoded, every transmission she analyzed, every piece of intelligence she extracted from the chaos of electromagnetic noise was in service of a cause she considered greater than her own life. The Führer was Germany's salvation. She believed this the way other people believed in gravity. But on this August evening, as the Red Army advanced from the east and the Americans from the west, even Helga could feel the walls closing in. An officer burst through the steel door, his uniform covered in concrete dust, his face pale beneath the grime. Burn everything. The defense line at the canal has collapsed. Evacuation in 30 minutes. Helga's hands did not shake as she fed classified documents into the incinerator. The flames consumed months of work in seconds, turning intelligence into ash, turning secrets into smoke. She had taken an oath. She had sworn loyalty to the Führer, to the Reich, to the cause of German greatness. Oaths her father had taught her were sacred. They were what separated civilization from chaos. She would not break her oath. Not even now. Not even as the world burned around her. 27 hours later, American soldiers found her in a basement on the western outskirts of Berlin. She was still clutching a leather satchel of encoded messages, still wearing her gray-green uniform, still standing, even though she had not slept in 2 days. She didn't resist arrest. She simply stared at the young American sergeant with something that looked like contempt, but might have been grief. You may have captured me, she said in perfect English, learned during a scholarship year in London before everything fell apart. But you will never break me. The sergeant, a farm boy from Iowa who looked tired beyond his 23 years, just sighed. Ma'am, we're not trying to break anyone. We're just trying to end a war. Helga didn't believe him. Not then. Why would she? The propaganda had been clear. Americans were barbaric. They bombed civilian targets without mercy. They showed no respect for the rules of war, no understanding of honor, no appreciation for discipline. But as they led her to a transport truck, hands bound loosely in front of her, she noticed something strange. The American soldiers weren't celebrating. They weren't cruel. They were just tired. Professionals doing a job they wanted to be finished with. That small observation lodged itself in her mind like a splinter. She told herself it meant nothing. Normandy, June 1944. The hospital train lurched to a sudden stop, throwing Margaret Weber against the wall of the medical car, hard enough to leave a bruise. At 28, she had the gentle face and steady hands of someone born to heal. Outside, she could hear shouting in English, the heavy rhythmic pounding of boots on gravel, the sharp commands of an assault in progress. Margaret came from a Catholic family in Bavaria, from a long line of country doctors and village midwives. Her father had taught her that suffering knew no nationality, that pain looked the same in every language, that the duty to heal transcended politics. When the war came, she joined the Red Cross not out of ideology, but out of a simple, stubborn conviction. If men were determined to destroy each other, someone had to be there to pick up the pieces. She had tended wounded soldiers on the Eastern Front in Italy and France. She had held the hands of dying 18-year-olds who called for their mothers in their final moments. She had seen wounds that would haunt her forever, burns that covered entire bodies, amputations performed with nothing but vodka for anesthesia, young men with their intestines held in by field dressings and prayer. And she had treated them all the same, German or Russian soldier or civilian Nazi or communist. In the operating theater, there were only patients, only human beings in pain. Now, as American medics stormed onto the train, she stood in front of her patients, arms spread wide. 23 wounded German soldiers lay on stretchers behind her. Most were barely conscious. All were defenseless. "They are wounded," she said in broken English, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "They need care." A young American medic, he couldn't have been more than 20, lowered his rifle. His face was smudged with dirt and his eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, but his voice was steady. "We're not here to hurt them, ma'am. We're here to help." And to Margaret's astonishment, they did. They carried the German wounded to ambulances with the same care they would have shown their own men. One American medic, a Negro soldier with gentle hands and a thick Southern accent, started an IV on a severely wounded German sergeant, working quickly and professionally while murmuring reassurance in English the German couldn't understand but clearly found comforting. Another American, seeing that Margaret was a nurse, handed her a medical kit. "You'll want to check his vitals, ma'am. BP's been dropping." They worked together for 20 minutes, German nurse and American medics, trying to stabilize a dying enemy soldier. In the end, they couldn't save him. But they tried. They tried with everything they had. Later, sitting in the back of a transport truck with her hands zip-tied loosely in front of her, Margaret felt the first stirring of something she couldn't quite name. Confusion, perhaps, or cognitive dissonance. The enemy was supposed to be cruel. The Americans were supposed to be monsters who bombed hospitals and murdered prisoners. But these men had treated German wounded with professional respect, with human decency, with the same code of medical ethics that she herself followed. "These are the enemy," she whispered to herself in German. "Why are they acting like healers?" No one answered. But the question would follow her across the Atlantic. Frankfurt, July 1944. Christina Hoffmann was 19 years old and had never known a Germany without Adolf Hitler. Her mother had died when she was 15, tuberculosis in the brutal winter of 1940, and the state had become her family. The Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, had given her everything her orphaned heart desperately needed: purpose, a structure, belonging, and the comforting certainty that she was part of something greater than herself. In the propaganda films, in the massive rallies, in the endless speeches broadcast over every radio she found, what grief had stolen from her? Hope, direction, the promise that if she just believed hard enough, if she just served faithfully enough, everything would turn out all right. She worked as an administrative assistant at a Luftwaffe communications center, typing reports and filing requisitions with the meticulous care of someone who understood that small details mattered. She wasn't a soldier, but she was proud to serve. When the American bombers came, she would help the other girls take shelter in the basement, singing patriotic songs to drown out the sound of explosions overhead. The Führer had a plan. Germany would triumph. The setbacks were temporary. Victory was inevitable. She believed this with the absolute faith of the very young. The night she was captured, Frankfurt was burning. The entire eastern section of the city had been turned into a hellscape of orange flame and black smoke. Christina and three other girls were trying to evacuate personnel files when the building took a direct hit. She remembered a sound like thunder, a sensation of flying, and then nothing. She woke up in an American field hospital. Her left arm bandaged, her ears still ringing from the blast. A Negro American soldier, the first black man she had ever seen in person, was offering her water. The propaganda had taught her that black soldiers were savages, that the Americans used them as expendable shock troops, that they were barely human. But this man's hands were gentle as he helped her drink. His eyes were kind, tired but kind. "You're gonna be okay, miss," he said softly in accented English she could barely understand. "You're safe now." Safe. The word felt like a lie. How could she be safe in the hands of the enemy? But his eyes, his voice, his careful touch as he adjusted her bandage, all of it suggested something the propaganda had never prepared her for. The possibility that the enemy might be human too. That thought terrified her more than any bomb ever had. Because if the Americans weren't monsters, then what did that make her? What did that make everything she had believed? The troopship USS General M.C. Meigs left Southampton on September 3, 1944, carrying 847 German female prisoners of war toward an uncertain future in America. In Hold C, deep below the waterline where the air was thick with the smell of oil and salt water, and fear, three very different women met for the first time. Helga claimed a middle bunk with the efficiency of someone used to making the best of bad situations. Margaret took the bunk above hers without complaint. Christina ended up below, curled into a ball, trying desperately not to cry. The first 3 days, no one spoke much. The ship rolled and pitched through the North Atlantic swells, and half the women spent their time retching into buckets. Meals came twice a day, thin soup that tasted of nothing, hard bread that required strong teeth. Occasionally some cheese that was more salt than dairy. It was barely enough to survive on, but it was more than many German civilians were getting back home. Helga organized the women in their section with unconscious military precision. She created cleaning schedules, rationed, and the water kept track of who was sick and who needed help. She did it automatically the way some people breathe. Leadership was simply her nature. Margaret helped those who were seasick, holding their heads over buckets, wiping their faces with damp cloths, murmuring comfort in German. She couldn't heal the fear that gnawed at all of them, but she could ease the physical discomfort. And that was something. Christina watched both of them, trying to understand how they could remain so calm when everything was falling apart. Helga's rigid control, Margaret's gentle competence. Both seemed like women from a different world, a world where you knew what to do even when nothing made sense anymore. On the 8th night, a storm hit. The ship pitched at angles that seemed to defy the laws of physics, groaning and creaking like a living thing in mortal pain. Lights flickered. Someone screamed. Water sloshed across the floor as a pipe burst somewhere in the darkness. Christina was sobbing, hands clutching the sides of her bunk hard enough to leave bruises. The darkness, the noise, the helpless sensation of being tossed by forces beyond human control, it was too much. Her mind kept returning to the building collapsing around her in Frankfurt, to the moment of flying through space, to the certainty that she was going to die. Margaret climbed down from her bunk and wrapped her arms around the younger woman. "Shh, it's all right. The ship is strong. We'll be fine." "We're going to die," Christina whimpered. "We're going to die, and no one will even know. We're not going to die." Helga's voice cut through the darkness like a blade, cold and certain. "The Americans wouldn't waste fuel transporting us across the ocean just to let us drown. We're too valuable as labor." "Labor?" Christina's voice cracked on the word. "You mean they'll work us to death like the camps?" Helga didn't answer immediately. In the darkness, her silence was heavy with all the things she didn't want to say. Finally, quietly, she spoke. "I don't know what they'll do, but we'll survive it. We're German. We endure. Margaret's voice was softer, more tentative. Maybe they won't be as cruel as we imagine. Don't be naive. Helga's tone was sharp. These are the people who bombed Dresden, who turned Hamburg into an inferno, who reduced Berlin to rubble. They showed no mercy to our cities. Why would they show mercy to us? Because, Margaret said quietly, choosing her words with care. Showing mercy is how you prove you're better than your enemy. The ship lurched again harder this time. Somewhere above them, they could hear the pounding of boots as American sailors secured the deck. And in the darkness of Hold Sea, 3 German women lay awake, each wrestling with their own fears about what awaited them in America. On the 10th day, the seas calmed. The women were allowed on deck for 30 minutes of fresh air and sunlight, a brief escape from the claustrophobic hold. Helga, Margaret, and Christina stood at the railing together, watching the endless gray-green ocean roll by, beneath a sky that was finally mercifully clear. I heard, Christina said hesitantly, her voice barely carrying over the sound of wind and water, that they put prisoners in cages, that they make them work in mines until they collapse. Another woman nearby added her own fear to the conversation. I heard they separate families, that they send children to different camps, and you never see them again. Helga lit a cigarette, American tobacco issued to the prisoners, along with their meager rations, and took a long drag. The smoke tasted different from German cigarettes, richer somehow. I decoded intelligence reports about their prisoner camps in North Africa, she said, her voice neutral, professional. The conditions were adequate by Geneva Convention standards. The Geneva Convention. Margaret tested the words carefully. That's the treaty about treating prisoners humanely, yes. A piece of paper. Helga flicked ash into the wind. Rules are only as good as the people following them. But even as she said it, something nagged at her. In all her intelligence work, analyzing thousands of reports and intercepted communications, she had never seen evidence of systematic American atrocities against POWs. Inefficiency, yes. Disorganization sometimes. A casual attitude toward military discipline that she found personally offensive. But systematic cruelty, deliberate violation of the rules of war. The reports had been strangely notably silent on that subject. She had assumed it was because the evidence was being suppressed. Now standing on the deck of an American ship, watching American sailors go about their duties with cheerful efficiency, she wondered for the first time if perhaps the evidence didn't exist because the crimes hadn't been committed. The thought was dangerous. She pushed it away. Christina leaned closer, her young face tight with worry. Helga, do you think we'll ever go home? Helga looked at the girl. She was barely more than a child, really, with her wide blue eyes and her desperate need for reassurance. Something in Helga's chest tightened in a way she didn't like. Yes, she lied smoothly. When the war is over, they'll send us home. She didn't add what she was thinking. If there's still a home to return to, if Germany still exists as anything more than rubble and memories. That night, as the ship cut through calmer waters toward America, Helga lay in her bunk and recited Hitler's speeches in her mind. It was a habit she had developed over the years, a way to ground herself, to remember what she fought for, to maintain her certainty in uncertain times. But for the first time, the familiar words felt hollow, empty, like prayers offered to a God who had stopped listening long ago. She squeezed her eyes shut and forced the doubt away. Doubt was weakness, doubt was betrayal, and Helga Schmidt had never been weak. The truck stopped with a hiss of air brakes. For a long moment, no one in the dim cargo area moved. Helga sat ramrod straight, jaw clenched, prepared for whatever came next. Margaret's hands were folded in prayer lips, moving silently. Christina was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Outside, they could hear American voices, firm, controlled, but not angry. One voice, younger than the others, said something that made another man laugh. The sound of that laughter was jarring, casual, relaxed, as if transporting enemy prisoners was just another routine task on an ordinary September afternoon. The tailgate dropped with a metallic clang. Sunlight flooded in, bright and pure and overwhelming. Helga raised her hand instinctively against the brightness. Then slowly her eyes adjusted to what lay before them. The first thing she saw was skyline. Not the gray, smoke-choked skies of Berlin, not the ash-laden air of a continent at war, but an endless expanse of blue so pure and clean it almost hurt to look at. The second thing was color. The gold of wheat fields stretching to the horizon, rippling in waves like a landlocked ocean. The green of carefully maintained grass. The white of freshly painted fence posts marking clean, straight boundaries. The air smelled like earth and growing things, like grass baking in the sun and grain ready for harvest. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark was singing its voice high and sweet and utterly oblivious to human conflict. This wasn't what Helga had expected, not at all. An American soldier, he couldn't have been more than 19 with freckles scattered across his sunburned nose, and the kind of easy posture that came from never having seen real combat gestured toward a row of barracks. This way, please, ladies. Please, the word hung in the air like a foreign object, strange and out of place. Enemies didn't say please. Guards didn't say please. This was wrong, somehow off script, not following any of the patterns Helga had prepared herself for. Christina stood frozen at the edge of the truck bed, unable to make her legs obey the simple command to move. The young American soldier stepped forward, offering his hand to help her down. Helga moved first, intercepting him with a sharp gesture. Ich brauche deine Hilfe nicht. The German words came out harsh, almost violent. I don't need your help. The soldier simply shrugged, stepped back and waited. No offense taken, no punishment for the outburst, no anger at being rejected, just patience. Margaret was the last to climb down. She accepted the soldier's offered hand without thinking, then froze, suddenly aware of what she had done. Accepting help from the enemy, touching the hand of an American soldier. But his hand was warm and calloused, a working man's hand like her father's had been, like her brother's hands before the war took them. And when she murmured "Danke" without thinking, he smiled slightly and replied, "You're welcome, ma'am." Ma'am, not prisoner, not German, not enemy, ma'am. The processing tent was organized with an efficiency that would have impressed even Helga. Tables arranged in precise rows. American clerks, women in crisp uniforms, working with quiet professionalism. Everything labeled, everything in its proper place, everything running like a well-oiled machine. When Helga's turn came, the clerk, a woman in her 40s with reading glasses perched on her nose and gray threading through her dark hair, looked up and said in careful textbook German, "Guten Tag, bitte Ihren Namen." Helga blinked. "You speak German?" "A little." The woman switched to English, her tone businesslike but not unkind. "My grandparents came from Hamburg. Do you speak English?" "Yes." "Good, that'll make this easier." The questions were straightforward, clinical. Name, rank, service number, date of capture, medical conditions, next of kin, no interrogation, no threats, no attempts to extract military intelligence, just paperwork, just bureaucracy, just the mechanical process of turning human beings into entries in a ledger. At the end of the processing line, each woman received a bundle. One blanket, olive drab and slightly rough, but clean. One towel, white and folded with hospital corners. One set of utensils, metal and solid. One bar of soap wrapped in plain brown paper. Christina stared at the soap in her hands as if it were a bar of gold. She brought it to her nose and the scent made her eyes well up instantly. Lemon, clean and bright and utterly civilian, utterly normal, utterly from a world she had thought was gone forever. "Real soap," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I haven't seen real soap since—" Helga snatched it from her hands, her movement quick and almost violent. "Don't be sentimental. It's just soap." But when she thought no one was looking, when the other women had moved ahead in the line, Helga brought her own bar to her nose and breathed in deeply. For just a moment, she remembered a life before the war. Before the bunkers and the bombs and the bodies. Before everything turned to ash and ideology. Before she became hard. She shoved the memory away violently. Memories were dangerous. Memories made you weak. Memories made you question. Barrack 7 was assigned to Helga, Margareta, Christina, and 23 other women. When they stepped inside, several women actually gasped aloud. Wooden bunks arranged in neat rows, but each bunk had a mattress. Not a thin pad of straw, not a rough pile of blankets, but an actual mattress with springs and padding. And sheets. Clean white sheets that smelled faintly of bleach and sunshine. And a pillow. An actual pillow. A wood-burning stove sat in the center of the room with chairs arranged around it in a sociable circle. Someone had even left a small stack of firewood beside it, neatly split and ready for the cold nights that would inevitably come. Near the door sat a bucket of clean water, a mop, and a broom. Tools for maintaining the space. Evidence that they were expected to live here, not just survive. Margaret sank onto one of the bunks, her hands running over the sheets with a kind of reverent disbelief. The fabric was rough institutional cotton, but it was clean. No stains, no holes, no smell of mildew or sweat or fear. This is better than, she started, then stopped herself, suddenly aware of the danger in finishing that sentence. Better than what our own soldiers have in the field. Helga finished for her, her voice cold and flat. Don't say it. Don't even think it. But they were all thinking it. All of them. The comparison was unavoidable. At 1800 hours, 6 o'clock by the civilian reckoning, that Americans seemed to prefer, a bell rang across the compound. Clear, loud, metallic. Like a school bell summoning children to class. Like a church bell calling the faithful to worship. The women looked at each other with uncertainty written across their faces. From the barracks across the way, they could see other prisoners forming orderly lines outside a long, low building with smoke rising from its chimney, the mess hall. They filed out, joining the line, moving slowly toward the building. And that's when Christina smelled it. Food. Real food. Not the watery cabbage smell of institutional soup. Not the yeasty sawdust smell of wartime bread. This was cooking. Actual cooking. The rich, savory smell of meat being prepared with care. The sweet, buttery smell of baked goods. The sharp, wonderful smell of coffee, real coffee, not the acorn and chicory substitute they had been choking down for years. Christina's stomach cramped so hard she almost doubled over. When was the last time she had smelled food like this? Before her mother died? Before rationing turned every meal into a mathematical equation of survival? The line moved forward slowly, each woman stepping through the door in turn. They entered the mess hall. Inside, the space was bright and clean. Windows along both walls let in the golden afternoon light, making the room feel almost cheerful. Long wooden tables stretched in neat rows, each one spotless. American cooks in white aprons worked behind a serving counter, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who did this 3 times a day, every day, year after year. A metal tray was pushed into Helga's hands. Solid, heavy, real metal, not dented tin, not recycled materials, not makeshift substitutes. Just a proper solid tray. Then came the food. First, a scoop of mashed potatoes. White as fresh snow, steam rising in visible wisps. Butter pooling in the center like a small molten sun. The server's hand was steady, professional, neither generous nor stingy. Just standard portion size. Next, a thick slice of meatloaf. The surface was dark and caramelized, the inside still visibly moist. Gravy was poured over it with a practiced flick of the wrist, thick and brown, and smelling of beef and onions and herbs. Sweet corn followed. Each kernel plump and golden, glistening with butter and moisture, looking like something from a painting rather than a prisoner's meal. A dinner roll, and when Helga picked it up to move it from the serving counter to her tray, it was still warm, still soft, still fresh enough that her fingers left slight indentations in its surface. A small pat of butter in foil, yellow and pure. And at the end of the line, absurdly, impossibly, incomprehensibly, a slice of apple pie. The crust was golden brown, cracked just enough to reveal the cinnamon-sugared fruit beneath. Steam still rose from it faintly. Coffee. Real coffee. The smell alone was enough to make you weep. Black and bitter and perfect, poured into a thick ceramic mug that held heat like a promise. Helga stood frozen, staring down at her tray. Her mind was trying to catalog what she was seeing, trying to fit it into some framework that made sense. Behind her, Margaret made a small sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Christina's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped her tray twice. They found seats at one of the long tables. Around them, other prisoners sat in various states of emotional collapse. Some were crying openly, tears streaming down their faces as they ate. Others consumed their food with mechanical intensity, as if afraid it would disappear if they didn't eat fast enough. A few refused to touch anything, convinced it must be drugged or poisoned or some kind of elaborate psychological torture. Christina lifted her fork, took a small bite of mashed potatoes. The taste exploded across her tongue. Creamy, buttery, salted perfectly, warm and smooth and utterly devastatingly real. She made a sound she didn't recognize, something animal and broken, and then she was sobbing, fork still in her hand, tears streaming down her face and dripping onto her tray. Margaret ate slowly, mechanically, her face carefully blank. But her hands trembled with each bite, and when she tasted the coffee bitter and strong and exactly right, she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer she hadn't said since childhood. Helga cut her meatloaf with surgical precision, took a small bite, chewed exactly 15 times, swallowed. It was good, better than good. It was the kind of meal that hadn't existed in Germany for 3 years, the kind of meal that German civilians saw only in their fading memories, the kind of meal that German soldiers in the field would have traded their weapons for. And here it was, on a tray, in an American prison camp, served to enemy combatants by professional cooks who showed neither pride nor contempt. Just routine. Just another day at work. Helga set down her fork. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table to hide the tremor, but the shaking traveled up her arms into her shoulders, into her chest, where something was breaking that she had thought was unbreakable. They feed their prisoners better than we feed our soldiers. The thought arrived with the force of revelation. Better than we feed our children. Better than we feed ourselves. The realization was a knife between her ribs, sharp and cold and impossibly painful. Across from her, a young woman, barely 20, whispered in German, her voice thick with tears. It tastes like before, like my grandmother's kitchen, before everything changed, before. An older prisoner shook her head sharply, her voice harsh with the need to maintain certainty. It's psychological warfare. They want to soften us, make us compliant, make us forget who we are. Or, Margaret said quietly, not looking up from her plate, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the mess hall. This is just how they live. The table fell silent. That thought, that simple observation, was more terrifying than any threat could have been. Because if this was just normal life in America, if this abundance was routine, if feeding prisoners decent food was simply standard procedure, then what did that say about Germany? About the promises they had believed, about the ideology they had served? What did it say about everything they thought they knew? 3 days passed in a kind of suspended reality. The women woke to bells, ate meals that seemed impossibly abundant, worked on assigned details, cleaning barracks or peeling vegetables in the kitchen, and went to sleep on mattresses that felt like luxuries. The routine was so normal, so utterly mundane, that it became its own form of psychological warfare. Helga maintained her rigid discipline. She woke before the morning bell made her bunk with military precision and organized the other women with the efficiency of someone who needed control the way other people needed air. But at night, lying in the darkness, she found herself thinking about that first meal, about the mashed potatoes and the coffee and the impossible slice of apple pie. Margaret worked in the camp infirmary, assisting the American doctor with minor ailments, headaches, twisted ankles, the occasional fever. She was grateful for the work, grateful for something familiar in a world that had become utterly strange. The American doctor, a man in his 50s, with kind eyes and steady hands, treated her not as a prisoner, but as a colleague. He asked her opinion on diagnoses. He showed her new techniques. He called her Nurse Weber. Christina wrote letters home every evening, long rambling letters to her aunt that she wasn't sure would ever arrive. She wrote about the barracks and the food and the strangeness of being treated with something that looked almost like respect. She didn't know how to describe what she was feeling. Confusion, perhaps? Or the slow, painful process of having your certainties eroded one small kindness at a time. On the fourth day, the noon bell rang as always. The women formed their orderly lines outside the mess hall as always. The sun was bright and warm for late September, and the air smelled of distant rain and harvest wheat. Inside, the routine was identical. Trays distributed, food served, the same professional efficiency from the American cooks in their white aprons. But today, as Helga moved through the serving line, something was different. The portions seemed larger. The meatloaf had been replaced with roasted chicken, the skin crispy and golden, the meat falling off the bone. There were green beans, actually green, not gray, from overcooking. There was cornbread, sweet and crumbling. There was gravy. There was butter. And at the end of the line, instead of pie, there was cake, yellow cake with chocolate frosting. Helga stood staring at her tray. Her mind was cataloging, analyzing, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. This wasn't survival rations. This wasn't even standard military fare. This was abundance. Deliberate, systematic, routine abundance. She sat down across from Margaret and Christina. Around them, the mess hall hummed with quiet conversation. Some of it in German, some in broken English, as the prisoners began to interact tentatively with the guards who supervised the meal. Christina took a bite of chicken and her eyes closed involuntarily. "It's perfect," she whispered. "It tastes like Sunday dinner, like when Mama was alive and we would go to church and then come home and she would cook for hours and the whole house would smell like—" Her voice broke. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I know. Do you—" Christina's eyes were bright with tears. "Do you know what this feels like? To eat like this when back home they're starving. My aunt, my cousins, they're eating soup made from grass, and I'm eating roasted chicken with butter and cake. How is that fair? How is that right?" Helga cut her chicken with precise movements, not looking up. "It's not meant to be fair. It's meant to break us." "Then why does it feel like kindness?" Margaret asked softly. Helga had no answer for that. October arrived with cooler temperatures and changing leaves. The wheat fields beyond the fence turned from gold to brown, and the morning air carried a bite that promised winter. The guards distributed heavier blankets without being asked. The wood stoves in the barracks were kept stocked with fuel. On a gray Tuesday morning, a Red Cross truck arrived at the camp. The women were called to assembly in groups of 20. When it was Helga's group's turn, they were led to a large room where tables were piled with mail. "Letters from home," the American officer explained in careful German. "The Red Cross has been routing correspondence. Not everyone will have letters. We apologize for the delay. Wartime, you understand." Helga didn't move forward when her name was called. She stood rigid, arms crossed, watching as other women rushed forward, crying, clutching envelopes like they were made of gold. Margaret's name was called. She stepped forward, slowly took the thin envelope with shaking hands, and returned to stand beside Helga. She stared at the handwriting on the envelope. Her sister's handwriting. Elizabeth. "Aren't you going to open it?" Christina asked. Her own name had been called. She held two letters, one from her aunt, one from a cousin she hadn't seen since childhood. "Not yet," Margaret said quietly. "Not here." That evening after dinner, after the sun had set and the barracks were lit only by the wood stove and a single overhead bulb, Margaret finally opened her letter. Her hands shook as she unfolded the thin paper, clearly reused the original writing scraped away to make room for new words. Helga and Christina sat nearby, pretending to read or mend clothes, but both were watching. Margaret read silently at first, her lips moving slightly. Then her hands began to shake harder. Then tears started to fall, dropping onto the paper, making the ink blur. "Greta," Christina moved closer. "What is it?" Margaret's voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper. "My sister. She writes from Munich. She says—" Margaret had to stop, had to breathe. "She says the city is mostly rubble now. The hospital where my father worked, it's gone. They live in a cellar. 32 people in a space meant for coal storage." She read directly from the letter, her voice breaking with every line. "We boil grass and potato peels for soup. Little Johann, you remember Johann, Elizabeth's son, he's 5 now. He has a cough that won't stop. We have no medicine. The ration cards give us 800 calories a day. That's for a full day, Greta, 800 calories. Mother asks about you constantly. She doesn't understand where you are. She thinks you're dead." Margaret folded the letter carefully, her hands moving with deliberate control. "She says they sold Mama's wedding ring for a loaf of bread. One loaf." The barracks was silent. Every woman there had stopped what she was doing. They all knew. They all understood, because most of them had received similar letters or would soon. Christina was crying, clutching her own letters to her chest. "My aunt writes that my cousins died, the twins. They were 6. There was a bombing and the shelter collapsed, and they couldn't get them out in time." That night's dinner had been pot roast. Thick slice of beef tender, enriched with carrots and potatoes and onions. There had been fresh bread. There had been butter. There had been baby again, this time cherry. Margaret had eaten it all. She had cleaned her plate completely mechanically, not tasting anything. And now she sat in the barracks with her sister's letter in her hands, and the food sat in her stomach like lead. "How can I eat like this?" she said to no one in particular, her voice hollow, "when they're starving, when my nephew is dying and I'm having pot roast and cherry pimp." Because you're alive. Helga's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. Because refusing to eat won't feed them. Because survival isn't a betrayal. Isn't it? Margaret looked up, her eyes red. Aren't we betraying them every time we take a full tray? Every time we sleep in a warm bed? Every time we accept comfort from the enemy while our families suffer? Helga opened her mouth, then closed it, because she had no answer. Because her own letter sat unopened in her footlocker, and she was terrified of what it would say. 2 days later, she finally opened it. Late at night when most of the others were asleep, she sat by the dying light of the wood stove and unfolded the single sheet of paper. Her younger brother's handwriting. Klaus, 22 years old, exempt from service because of his asthma. The letter was short, brutally efficiently short. Helga, father died 3 weeks ago. Building collapsed during air raid. They couldn't recover the body. I am alone. The apartment is gone. I'm staying with the Hoffmans, but they can barely feed themselves. The Reich you believed in is ash. The promises were lies. If you are alive, if you are reading this, stay where you are. There is nothing left here. Klaus. Helga read it 3 times. Her hands didn't shake. Her eyes stayed dry. She had trained herself long ago not to show weakness, not to break, not to let emotion interfere with duty. But something inside her chest was cracking anyway. Some foundational support beam of her identity was fracturing under weight it was never designed to bear. Her father, dead. The man who had taught her about duty and honor and the importance of oaths. The man whose memory had driven her entire adult life, gone, crushed under rubble while she sat in an American prison camp eating mashed potatoes. She folded the letter with precise, controlled movements, put it in her pocket, lay down in her bunk and stared at the ceiling. The Reich you believed in is ash. Klaus was wrong. He had to be wrong. The setbacks were temporary. The Führer had a plan. Germany would rise again. It had to. Because if it didn't, if everything she had done was in service of a lie, then what did that make her? A fool, a monster, or worse, both. The days developed a rhythm. Morning bell at 6, breakfast at 6:30, work details from 8 to noon, lunch at 12:30, more work until 5. Dinner at 6, free time until lights out at 10. The routine was punctuated by small moments that accumulated like drops of water wearing away stone. There was the afternoon Margaret was working in the infirmary when a young American guard came in with a cut on his hand. She cleaned it, bandaged it, gave him basic instructions for care. As he was leaving, he paused at the door. "Thank you, ma'am. You have got a good touch, gentle." "I'm a nurse," she replied automatically. "It's what I do." He smiled a kid's smile, open and without guile. "My mom's a nurse too, back in Ohio. She'd like you." The comment was so casual, so utterly normal, that it left Margaret speechless. His mom was a nurse, in Ohio, and he thought his mother would like a German prisoner of war. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful. There was the day Christina was assigned to kitchen duty and found herself working beside an American cook, a woman in her 60s with flour-dusted hands and a no-nonsense demeanor. The woman showed Christina how to knead bread properly, her hands guiding the younger woman's through the rhythm. "That's it, honey. You've got the feel for it. My grandmother taught me this when I was about your age." Christina looked at the woman, really looked at her for the first time. She had kind eyes, laugh lines, hands that had clearly spent decades preparing food with care. "Your grandmother, she was German?" Christina asked hesitantly. "Sure was. Came over in 1889, from a little town near Stuttgart. You know it." Christina nodded mutely. Stuttgart had been bombed to rubble. This woman's ancestral hometown was gone. But she was teaching her granddaughters baking techniques to an enemy prisoner anyway. There was the Sunday afternoon when the guards organized a baseball game and invited some of the prisoners to watch. Helga went, telling herself it was reconnaissance learning about the enemy. She stood at the edge of the field, arms crossed, watching. The Americans played with enthusiasm and zero discipline. They shouted at each other, argued good-naturedly about calls, laughed when someone made an error. One player hit the ball badly and it rolled toward Helga. She picked it up automatically. A young soldier jogged over, breathing hard. "Thanks, ma'am. You want to throw it back?" Helga threw the ball, a perfect hard throw that snapped into his glove with satisfying force. His eyebrows went up. "You've got an arm on you. You play. We didn't have baseball in Germany." That's a shame. You'd be good at it. He jogged back to the field and Helga stood there confused by the casual compliment. These moments accumulated, small cracks in the wool of certainty, each one insignificant on its own, but together forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The Americans weren't cruel. They weren't even particularly interested in humiliating their prisoners. They were just normal, professional, doing their jobs, living their lives, treating enemy combatants with the same basic decency they would show anyone else. And that normality was more devastating than any torture could have been. November brought real cold. The wheat fields beyond the fence were bare brown stubble now, and morning frost painted the windows in crystalline patterns. The guards distributed winter coats without ceremony, heavy wool coats used but serviceable with liners that actually provided warmth. Helga stood in the distribution line holding the coat she'd been given. It was too big for her, clearly meant for someone taller, but it was warm, genuinely warm. The kind of coat that German soldiers in Russia would have killed for. That night, she received Klaus's second letter. It was even shorter than the first. Sister, I have been conscripted, Volkssturm. They are taking everyone now, even those previously exempt. I leave for training tomorrow. I don't expect to survive. The war is lost, Helga. Everyone knows it except those too fanatical to see. I'm glad you're in America. At least one of us will live. Goodbye. Helga read the letter once, folded it, put it in the footlocker with the first one. Then she walked outside. The November air was sharp and clean cold enough to hurt her lungs. The camp was quiet, most prisoners already asleep. A guard walked his patrol route in the distance, his footsteps crunching on frost-stiffened grass. Helga walked to the fence. Not too close, she knew the rules about perimeter approach, but close enough to see beyond it, to see the endless dark fields, to see the stars impossibly bright in the cold, clear air. She thought about Klaus, 22 years old with weak lungs, being handed a rifle and sent to die for a cause that was already lost. She thought about her father crushed under rubble in Berlin. She thought about the years she had spent in service to the Reich, decoding messages, believing every word of every speech, certain that she was part of something glorious. And she thought about the coat she was wearing. Warm, dry, provided by the enemy. Her hands started shaking. Then her shoulders. Then her whole body was shaking and she couldn't stop. It couldn't control. It couldn't force the discipline back into her spine. She made a sound low and animal and sank to her knees in the cold grass. Everything she had believed was a lie. The strength, the glory, the certainty of victory. All of it lies. And she had believed so completely, had served so faithfully, had given everything she had to a cause that was built on nothing but propaganda and hate. What did that make her? What kind of fool believes in lies so thoroughly that they sacrifice their whole life to them? She didn't hear Margaret approach, only became aware of her when the other woman knelt beside her in the grass close, but not touching. He's dead, isn't he? Margaret asked quietly. Your father, or your brother, or both. Klaus is going to die. Helga's voice was hoarse, broken. They're sending him to fight, and he's going to do it for nothing. For a Reich that's already fallen. For Luz. I know. I believed it all. The words came out like a confession. Every speech, every promise, I believe we were right. That we were strong, that we were building something great. I know, Margaret said again. And now I'm here eating chicken and wearing warm coats and sleeping in a bed, and my brother is going to die, and my father is already dead, and my entire life has been in service to a lie. Margaret did touch her, then a hand on her shoulder. Solid, warm, real. You couldn't have known, she said. None of us could have known. We believed what we were taught. We served because we thought it was right. I should have questioned. Helga's voice was vicious, now turned inward. I should have seen. The signs were there. The camps, the disappeared people, the books they burned. I should have known. Maybe, but you didn't. And now you do. So what will you do with that knowledge? Helga looked up at the stars, cold and distant and utterly indifferent to human suffering. I don't know, she said finally. I don't know anything anymore. They sat there into the cold grass for a long time. Two enemy prisoners in an American camp watching the stars wheel overhead, wrestling with the death of certainty. Back in the barracks, Christina was writing in her diary, a small notebook she had been given by one of the American clerks. She wrote slowly, carefully, trying to capture what she was feeling. Week 1, I wrote that the Americans were tricking us. Week 4, I wrote that maybe they weren't as bad as we thought. Now it's week 8, and I don't know what to write anymore. Because what if we were wrong? What if everything we were taught was backwards? What if the enemy wasn't evil, just different? What if we were the ones who were lost? She stopped writing, read what she had written, and felt something shift in her chest, some fundamental understanding of the world rearranging itself into a new pattern. What if we were the bad ones, she wrote finally. What if all along we were the bad ones and we just couldn't see it? The question sat on the page unanswered and unanswerable. Outside, the November wind picked up, rattling the barracks windows. Inside, the wood stove crackled quietly. And in the darkness, 3 German women lay awake, each wrestling with the slow, painful death of everything they had once believed. The letters kept coming. Every 2 weeks, the Red Cross truck would arrive and more mail would be distributed. And every letter brought more evidence of Germany's collapse, more stories of starvation, more deaths, more desperate pleas for the war to end. And every day, 3 times a day, the mess hall bell would ring, and the food would be abundant, and the contrast would become more unbearable. This was the true weapon, Helga realized. Not the bombs, not the armies, not even the inevitable military defeat. The true weapon was this, showing them a better way. Demonstrating that strength didn't have to be cruel. That victory didn't require vengeance. That even an enemy could be treated with dignity. It was the most devastating thing imaginable. Because you couldn't fight it. You couldn't resist it. You could only sit with it day after day, meal after meal, letter after letter, and feel everything you thought you knew slowly disintegrate. Winter descended on the Kansas plains with the quiet inevitability of truth. The sky turned the color of old steel, and the wind carried needles of ice that found every gap in every wall. The wheat fields beyond the fence became a wasteland of stubble and frozen earth, stretching to a horizon that seemed to get farther away with each passing day. Inside the camp, the wood stoves burned constantly. The Americans kept them supplied with fuel, arriving every morning with wagons loaded with split logs. The guards never made a show of it, never asked for gratitude, never used it as leverage. They just kept the stoves burning because that was procedure. Because letting prisoners freeze would violate the rules they followed with almost religious devotion. Helga had stopped trying to make sense of it. She went through her days with mechanical efficiency, organizing work details, maintaining discipline among the women in her barracks, keeping the systems running that gave structure to captivity. But at night, lying in her bunk with the sound of wind howling outside and the stove crackling inside, she found herself thinking about Klaus. The 3rd letter had arrived in mid-November. Just 3 lines in handwriting that looked rushed, almost frantic. Training is 2 weeks, then we go east. The Russians are at the border. Tell me there is something worth dying for. I can't find it anymore. She had written back, carefully composing words of encouragement and duty and honor. All the things she had believed her entire life. But when she read what she had written, the words felt hollow. Empty containers that once held meaning, but now held only air. She tore up the letter and started again. This time she wrote the truth. Stay alive, however you can. The cause is lost. The war's over, we just haven't admitted it yet. If you can surrender to the Americans, do it. They feed us 3 times a day, and the food is real. They give us beds and blankets, and they don't beat us. I know this sounds insane, but it's true. Stay alive, Klaus. That's all that matters now. Stay alive. She didn't know if the letter would reach him. Didn't know if he was already dead, another pointless sacrifice to ideology. But she sent it anyway because it was the only thing she could do. December brought the first real snow. It fell softly through the night, coating everything in white silence. When Helga woke and looked out the window, the camp had been transformed into something almost beautiful. The fence posts wore caps of snow. The barracks roofs were frosted white. Even the guard towers looked peaceful, like watchtowers in a fairy tale rather than a prison. On the morning of December 24th, the camp commandant made an announcement during breakfast. He was a colonel in his 50s, a career officer with gray temples and the bearing of someone who had seen multiple wars and was tired of all of them. Ladies, he said in careful, heavily accented German, tomorrow is Christmas. In America, this is an important holiday. We will have a special dinner. There will also be a small celebration in the recreation hall this evening. Attendance is voluntary. That is all. The women looked at each other with uncertainty. Christmas in captivity. Christmas in enemy hands. Christmas while their families starved in the ruins of Germany. Margaret went to the celebration. She told herself it was curiosity, but really it was loneliness. The need to be around other people to hear music, to pretend for just a few hours that the world wasn't broken. The recreation hall had been decorated with care. Garlands made from pine branches somehow acquired from somewhere. Candles on tables, their light warm and gentle. And in the corner, impossibly a Christmas tree. Small and somewhat scraggly, but unmistakably a tree decorated with paper ornaments that the American Guards had clearly made themselves. There was music playing from a phonograph, American carols she didn't recognize. Some of the guards were there, standing awkwardly along the walls, clearly unsure what to do at a party with enemy prisoners. Coffee and cookies had been set out on a long table. Margaret stood near the door, ready to leave, unsure why she had come. Then someone changed the record on the phonograph, and a familiar melody filled the room. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Silent Night, in German. She felt tears spring to her eyes immediately. The song her mother had sung every Christmas Eve. The song that had filled churches across Germany for generations. The song that connected her to a world before the war, before the ideology, before everything fell apart. Around her, other prisoners were crying too. Some singing along softly, their voices breaking on the familiar words. And then, unexpectedly, some of the American Guards began to sing. Not in German, but in English. The same melody, different words, but the same song. Silent night, holy night. All is calm, all is bright. German and English voices rising together in the recreation hall of a prison camp. The same song, the same faith, the same longing for peace. The war had drawn them into opposition, but this song remembered what they had been before, what they could be again. Christina was standing beside Margaret, tears streaming down her face. "How is this possible?" she whispered. "How can the enemy sing our songs?" "Maybe," Margaret said softly, "they were never really the enemy. Maybe we just called them that because we were told to." Christmas dinner was extraordinary. Roasted turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes and gravy, cranberry sauce, green beans with almonds, fresh bread, and for dessert, pumpkin pie. Helga sat at her usual table, eating mechanically, tasting nothing. Across from her, Christina was crying again, but eating anyway, unwilling to let grief stop her from consuming food that her aunt and cousins would never see. "My mother made turkey once," Christina said through her tears. "I was 7 before she got sick. It was the most wonderful thing I'd ever tasted. This is better. How is that possible? How can the enemy's turkey be better than my mother's? Because they have everything," Helga thought but didn't say. Because they have resources and systems in a country that isn't being bombed into rubble. Because they can afford to be generous. But even as she thought it, she knew that wasn't the whole answer. Plenty of nations had resources. That didn't mean they treated their prisoners well. The generosity was a choice, a deliberate policy, a reflection of values that ran deeper than strategy. After dinner, as the prisoners filed back to their barracks through the snow, Helga noticed something. The guards who supervised the movement weren't watching them with suspicion or hostility. They were just making sure everyone got back safely, making sure no one slipped on the ice, making sure the older women who struggled with the cold made it to warmth. One guard, the young freckled one who had been there since their arrival, wished them Merry Christmas as they passed. Some of the women returned the greeting, others ignored him. But he kept saying it anyway, his voice cheerful and genuine. Helga paused at the barracks door and looked back. The guard was watching her. Their eyes met for a moment. He touched his cap in a small salute. She hesitated, then nodded once in acknowledgement. It was a tiny gesture, meaningless really, but it felt like crossing some invisible line. January was bitter. The coldest month Helga could remember, with temperatures that turned breath into ice crystals and made the walk to the mess hall an ordeal. But the stove stayed fueled. The blankets stayed warm. The meals stayed hot and abundant. Work details increased as the camp administration found more ways to keep the prisoners occupied. Helga was assigned to help with administrative tasks in the main office, translating documents and organizing files. It was here that she met Captain Morrison. He was in his early 40s with the weathered face of someone who had spent time in the sun and the careful movements of someone who had been wounded in the past. He walked with a slight limp, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Fräulein Schmidt, he said when they were introduced, his German grammatically correct but heavily accented. I understand you speak excellent English. I studied in London, she replied, before the war. Ah, I spent a summer in Hamburg in 1936. Beautiful city. I hope it survives. Helga's throat tightened. Hamburg was gone. The firestorm had seen to that, but she just nodded. They worked together in silence for the first hour, Helga translating requisition forms and personnel records, while Morrison reviewed them and filed them appropriately. Then he spoke again, his voice casual. What did you do in the war before capture? Communications, intelligence, signal analysis. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. Important work, difficult work, must have required significant skill. Helga looked up sharply, searching for mockery in his face. Found none, just professional respect. I did my duty, she said carefully. I'm sure you did it well. They returned to work. Another hour passed. Helga found herself relaxing slightly. Morrison treated her like a colleague, not a prisoner, asked her opinion on filing systems, showed her how the American military organized its paperwork, explained procedures patiently when she had questions. Finally, as the afternoon wore on, she had to ask, why are you being kind to me? To us, we were your enemies. We killed your soldiers. Why treat us with respect? Morrison set down the file he was holding and looked at her directly. His eyes were brown, tired, but clear. Because you're not my enemy anymore. The war is over for you. You're a prisoner now, and there are rules about how prisoners are treated. Geneva Convention. We follow those rules. But why surely you could justify some degree of cruelty? We did terrible things. Yes, Morrison said quietly. Germany did terrible things. The Reich did terrible things. But did you personally do terrible things, Fräulein Schmidt? Or were you just a woman trying to serve her country? Helga opened her mouth, closed it. She thought about the intelligence she had decoded, the troop movements that had led to battles, the communications that had enabled operations. How many deaths was she responsible for? How much blood on her hands? I don't know, she said finally. I don't know what I am. Morrison nodded as if he understood. The thing about war, he said, is that it makes everyone complicit. You did your duty. Our bomber crews did theirs. The question isn't whether we're guilty. We all are in our way. The question is what we do after, how we rebuild, whether we can learn to be human again. And you think feeding us well and giving us warm beds will teach us to be human? No. Morrison smiled slightly. But it might teach you that being human doesn't require being cruel. That strength can be gentle. That victory doesn't demand vengeance. Helga stared at him. You're trying to shame us. No, I'm trying to show you that there's another way. Whether you learn from it is up to you. That night, Helga lay awake thinking about that conversation, about Morrison's limp clearly from some old wound, about his measured words and his patient teaching, about his fundamental belief that following rules mattered more than satisfying emotion. This was power, she realized. Real power. Not the brittle, fearful power of the Reich, which required constant violence to maintain itself, but the quiet, confident power of a nation that could afford to be merciful because it didn't doubt its own strength. It was the most humbling thing she had ever encountered. May arrived with warmth and wildflowers. The fields beyond the fence turned green again, and the air filled with the sound of returning birds. The snow was gone, the cold was gone, and the world felt new in a way that was almost painful. On the morning of May 8th, the camp commandant assembled all the prisoners in the central yard. His face was grave. The guards stood at attention, their rifles slung, their postures formal. Ladies, the commandant said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd, the war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich has fallen. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Then slowly, gradually, the reactions began. Some women collapsed to their knees sobbing. Others stood frozen faces blank with shock. A few, the oldest ones who had lived through the First War, simply closed their eyes and whispered thanks to God. Helga stood ramrod straight, hands clenched at her sides. It was over. Everything she had fought for, everything she had believed in, everything she had sacrificed. Over. Finished. Defeated. The Reich you believed in is ash. Klaus had been right. Beside her, Christina was making a sound somewhere between laughter and sobbing. It's over, she kept repeating. It's over. No more bombs. No more killing. It's over. Margaret had her hands clasped in prayer lips, moving silently. Tears streamed down her face, but her expression was peaceful, relieved, grateful. The commandant continued speaking. You will remain here until arrangements can be made for repatriation. This will take time. Germany is currently under occupation. Conditions are difficult. We will process you individually to determine the best course of action for each person. In the meantime, the camp will continue to operate normally. You will continue to receive meals and shelter and medical care. That is all. That evening's dinner was special, better than usual. Roasted chicken again, the skin golden and crispy, the meat tender, potatoes, vegetables, fresh bread, pie. But this time it wasn't a routine meal. This was acknowledgement, recognition of the moment. The American guards served the food with the same professional efficiency, but there was something different in the air. Not celebration exactly, more like solemn recognition that something had ended. One guard, the older one, who worked in the kitchen, raised his cup of coffee in a simple gesture. To peace, he said quietly. A few of the prisoners raised their cups in return. Others couldn't, but the gesture hung there, an offering of shared humanity across the divide. Helga ate her meal, slowly tasting every bite this time. The chicken was perfectly seasoned. The potatoes were creamy. The pie was sweet. It was good food prepared with care, served without malice. This is what we lost, she thought. This is what we threw away for ideology. The simple ability to sit down with other human beings and share a meal without hate. After dinner, the three women walked to the fence together. They stood looking out at the darkening fields, at the first stars appearing in the purple sky, at the vast empty spaces that seemed to represent both ending and possibility. What happens now? Christina asked quietly. Where do we go? Kakimento. Home, Margaret said. Eventually, though I don't know what we'll find there. Will you go back? Christina looked at Helga. To Berlin. Helga was quiet for a long time, then she shook her head slowly. There's nothing left there. Klaus is probably dead. My father is dead. The apartment is rubble. The Reich is gone. What would I go back to? Family, Margaret suggested gently. I have no family. The words came out harder than Helga intended. I have no country. I have nothing except what I've learned here. And what have you learned? Christina asked. Helga looked at the younger woman. 19 years old and already so much loss in her eyes. I learned that everything I believed was wrong, that the enemy was more honorable than my own leaders, that strength doesn't come from fear and cruelty, that the nation I thought was weak and decadent actually had principles it valued more than victory. She paused, searching for the right words. I learned that I wasted my life serving a lie. And I learned that maybe there's still time to do something meaningful with whatever years I have left. The next morning, Captain Morrison called Helga to his office. She went expecting processing for repatriation. Instead, he offered her a chair and poured 2 cups of coffee. I've been reviewing your file, he said without preamble. Your language skills are exceptional. Your organizational abilities are strong. You understand both German and American systems. Yeah, Helga said warily, unsure where this was going. The occupation forces are going to need translators, liaisons, people who can help bridge the gap between American administration and German civilians. It's not glamorous work. It won't be easy. You'll be working for the side that defeated you. But it would be useful, important even. Helga stared at him. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a choice. You can wait for repatriation to a ruined country where you have nothing. Or you can work with us. Help rebuild. Use your skills for something constructive instead of destructive. Why would you trust me? Morrison smiled slightly. Because you've spent 8 months here proving that you can follow rules and work within a system. Because you've shown that you can learn and adapt. because everyone deserves a chance at redemption. Helga set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. If I said yes, if I chose to work with you, what would that make me? A survivor, Morrison said simply. Someone who understands that the future matters more than the past. She thought about Klaus dead or captured or hiding somewhere in the ruins. She thought about her father buried under rubble. She thought about the years she had spent believing in a cause that had led only to destruction. I'll help rebuild what I helped destroy, she said finally. Yes, I'll do it. 3 weeks later, Margaret received word that her sister had survived. Elizabeth and her son Johann were alive, living with relatives in the countryside outside Munich. Margaret cried when she got the news, cried harder than she had cried since capture. She would go home. She would work as a nurse again. She would help heal the broken bodies and broken spirits of a shattered nation. It was what she had always done. It was who she was. On her last day in the camp, she sought out the American doctor she had worked with. He shook her hand formally, then pulled her into a brief hug. "You're good at this," he said. "Don't let the war take that from you. The world needs healers." "Thank you," she said, "for treating me like a colleague, for reminding me what medicine is supposed to be." Christina was the most conflicted. Her aunt was alive, barely living in the ruins of Hamburg. She wanted Christina to come home. But Christina had changed. The girl who had believed in the Führer with absolute faith was gone. In her place was someone who questioned everything, who no longer knew what truth looked like. "I'll go back," she told Helga and Margaret on the night before her departure. "But not to rebuild the old Germany, to help build something new, something better. I'll teach. I'll tell the truth. I'll make sure the next generation doesn't believe the lies we believed." Helga smiled a real smile for the first time in months. "Good. That's good work." The final breakfast together was quiet. They sat at their usual table eating the same food they had eaten hundreds of times. Oatmeal, toast, eggs, coffee. Simple, ordinary, abundant. "I'll miss the coffee most," Christina said, trying to lighten the mood. "I'll miss feeling safe," Margaret admitted. "Isn't that strange, to miss being a prisoner?" "You're not missing prison," Helga said quietly. "You're missing structure, certainty, the knowledge that you'll be treated fairly." They sat in silence, each processing what that meant. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Do you think they know, the Americans, what they did for us?" "What do you mean?" Christina asked. "They didn't just feed us. They freed us from the propaganda, from the lies. They showed us a different way of being." Helga nodded slowly. "I think some of them know. Morrison knows. He understands that mercy can be more powerful than punishment, that showing us kindness was more devastating than showing us cruelty." "How do you mean devastating?" Christina looked confused. "Because you can resist cruelty," Helga explained. "You can hate your tormentors and maintain your beliefs. But kindness, genuine principled kindness, that breaks through every defense. That forces you to confront the truth about who you were and what you served." They finished their meal in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Later that morning, the three women stood together by the fence one last time. The fields beyond were bright green, lush with spring growth. The sky was the brilliant blue of possibility. "I'll never forget this place," Margaret said softly. "None of us will," Helga agreed. An American guard walked by the young freckled one who had been there from the beginning. He paused, looking at them. "You ladies doing all right?" Christina impulsively stepped forward and hugged him. He froze, startled, then awkwardly patted her shoulder. "Thank you," she said in halting English. "For everything." He smiled, that open American smile she had learned to recognize. "Just doing our job, miss. Good luck out there." As the buses arrived to take them to processing centers, to ships, to their separate futures, the three women held each other briefly. No words, just acknowledgement of shared experience, shared transformation, shared understanding. Years later, when people asked Helga about the war, about being a prisoner, they expected stories of suffering. Instead, she told them about lunch. She described the first meal, the shock of seeing mashed potatoes and meatloaf and apple pie. She talked about the coffee that tasted like civilization. She spoke about an enemy who treated prisoners with dignity, even though they had no obligation to do so. And she explained patiently, repeatedly, how food became a weapon more powerful than any bomb, how abundance became accusation, how mercy became the most devastating form of victory. "They conquered us, not with cruelty," she would say, but with conscience. They showed us that strength doesn't require violence, that victory doesn't require vengeance, that even an enemy deserves basic human dignity. She would pause, looking out whatever window was available, as if seeing again those Kansas wheat fields, that endless American sky. Every meal was a lesson, every kindness was an accusation, every moment of decent treatment was proof that everything we had been taught was a lie. They didn't break us with torture. They healed us with decency. And in the end, that simple lunch, that ordinary American meal, did more to defeat the Reich than any bomb ever could. Because it showed us the truth. That strength comes from principle, not from fear. That power can be gentle. That humanity is stronger than ideology. And once you see that, once you truly understand it, you can never go back to believing the lies. In Hamburg, Christina became a teacher. She spent 40 years in classrooms teaching critical thinking, teaching students to question, teaching them that blind belief was the most dangerous thing in the world. In Munich, Margareta worked as a nurse until she was 73. She treated German and Allied, rich and poor, friend and former enemy, with exactly the same care. In America, Helga worked for the occupation forces and then emigrated permanently in 1952. She spent the rest of her life speaking about the power of principle over propaganda, about the strength that comes from following rules even when it would be easier not to. The three women stayed in contact until their deaths, writing letters, visiting when they could, maintaining a friendship forged in captivity and transformation. They called themselves the Lunch Club, a private joke that no one else ever quite understood. When asked about their bond, Helga said it best. "We were bound not by what we believed, but by what we learned. The enemy taught us to be human again. They showed us that kindness is not weakness, that mercy is not surrender, that treating others with dignity is not naive. It's civilized." And that lesson, learned over countless meals in a prison camp in Kansas, changed everything. The sun set over the wheat fields one last time as the buses pulled away. Golden light painted everything in shades of amber and honey. The barracks, the mess hall, the fence that had contained them all glowed in that forgiving light. Inside the camp, American guards were already preparing for the next group of prisoners, cleaning barracks, stocking wood for stoves, planning menus for meals that would be served 3 times a day, every day, with the same professional efficiency. Not because they were soft, not because they were naive, but because they had principles. And those principles, they believed, were worth more than revenge. The buses disappeared into the distance, carrying women who had arrived as enemies and were leaving as something else. Not quite allies, not quite friends, but witnesses. People who had seen both sides and understood that humanity was more complicated than propaganda allowed. They carried with them a simple truth learned over hundreds of meals: that how you treat your enemies says more about you than how you treat your friends. That showing mercy doesn't make you weak. It proves you're strong enough not to need cruelty, and that sometimes the greatest victory is teaching your enemy to be better than they were. The wheat fields rippled in the evening breeze, golden and endless. The stars began to appear one by one in a sky that stretched over both victor and vanquished, both past and future, both memory and hope. Somewhere in those fields, in that sky, in the space between what was and what could be, 3 women carried forward a lesson learned at the enemy's table. That kindness, genuine and principled, and offered without expectation of return, is the most powerful weapon ever created. And that sometimes the best way to win a war is to show your enemy what peace looks like, one meal at a time.